"Excuse me, sir. I think that Omega is sleeping on you." Adrian Cross lowered his eyes from the financial report glowing on his phone and found a stranger's head resting against his shoulder. The young man had somehow crossed the few inches between their seats without either of them noticing, his cheek pressed against Adrian's charcoal wool coat, his breathing slow and steady despite the rattle of the morning train. Across the aisle, an older woman gave Adrian an apologetic smile, as though she felt responsible. Adrian said nothing. He simply looked at the sleeping stranger. 20 minutes earlier, Evan Miller had boarded the 7:42 commuter train into downtown Chicago, convinced that staying awake would be easy. He had survived on 3 hours of sleep before. He had worked until nearly 2 a.m., gone home, showered, printed another copy of his resume, and changed into the best clothes he owned. Navy slacks, a white button-down shirt, and a second-hand overcoat that was warm enough if the wind wasn't too cruel. Today mattered. At 9 a.m., Evan had an interview for an entry-level position at Croswell Industries, the kind of opportunity that could finally pull him out of temporary jobs and overdue bills. He had repeated one rule while waiting on the freezing platform: do not fall asleep. Then the train heater came on. The windows fogged at the edges. The steady rhythm of steel wheels against the tracks softened into something almost hypnotic. Evan blinked once, twice, and disappeared into sleep. Adrian, meanwhile, had spent the ride reviewing numbers for an acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At 31, he had built a reputation for making decisions faster than most executives could prepare excuses. Employees lowered their voices when he entered conference rooms. Competitors called him ruthless when cameras weren't around. His schedule was divided into 10-minute blocks, and at 8:10 that morning, a car was supposed to collect him 2 stops ahead and take him directly to a board meeting. Adrian disliked delays. He disliked unpredictability even more, and he absolutely disliked strangers touching him. Yet he didn't move. Evan shifted slightly. When the train rounded a curve, his brow tightening as though even sleep couldn't completely erase whatever had exhausted him. A worn manila folder rested against his chest, held there by one loose hand. Adrian noticed dark circles beneath his eyes and a tiny ink stain near his thumb. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should have interested him. The overhead speaker announced Adrian's stop. He glanced toward the doors, then at the time, then back at Evan. Around them, passengers stood, gathered bags, and moved into the aisle. The doors slid open, letting in a sharp gust of January air. Adrian could wake him. One quiet word would solve the problem. Instead, Adrian remained perfectly still. The warning chimes sounded. The doors closed. His stop disappeared behind them. For the first time in years, Adrian Cross deliberately missed an appointment pickup because a stranger was asleep on his shoulder. Evan woke when the train slowed into the next station, and for 3 peaceful seconds, he had no idea where he was. Then he noticed the expensive charcoal wool beneath his cheek. His eyes opened wide. He jerked upright so quickly that the manila folder on his lap slipped toward the floor. "Oh my God, I am so sorry." The stranger caught the folder before it landed, calm enough to make Evan feel even more embarrassed. "You were tired," he said. His voice was low and controlled, the kind that somehow remained clear beneath the rumble of the train. Evan rubbed a hand over his face. That is not an excuse for using another passenger as a pillow. Something almost resembling amusement passed through the man's gray eyes. "I survived." Evan looked toward the window and saw an unfamiliar station sign sliding past. His stomach dropped. "Wait. What stop is this?" The stranger told him. Evan grabbed his phone. 8:17 a.m. No. He began collecting his things. "I have an interview at 9. Downtown." "Yes." Evan checked the transit map above the doors, mentally calculating how much time he had lost. "I was supposed to transfer 2 stops ago. You can transfer at the next station. The express runs every 12 minutes. Evan looked at him. "You know the schedule?" "I pay attention." That answer somehow suited him. Everything about the stranger looked precise, from the clean line of his dark coat to the silver watch at his wrist. Evan realized he had probably spent half an hour drooling on someone who looked like he belonged in a private car instead of public transit. "I am Evan, by the way, since I already destroyed every normal boundary between strangers." The man's attention rested on him for a moment. "Adrian. Well, Adrian, thank you for not throwing me into the aisle." Evan reached for his folder, but several papers slid free. Adrian caught one against his knee. Evan leaned forward. Sorry. Again. Adrian's gaze dropped to the page before returning it. Crosswell Industries was printed across the top above Evan's interview confirmation. Crosswell, Adrian said. You are interviewing there. Hopefully working there if I do not arrive looking like I slept on public transportation. Technically, you did. Evan laughed despite himself. Great. Now I have honesty working against me too. He tucked the paper away. Do you know the company? A little. Then maybe you know whether the stories about their chief executive officer are true. Adrian's expression became unreadable. Which stories? Evan lowered his voice as though Crosswell executives might be hiding among the commuters. That he is terrifying. Apparently, the man can walk into a conference room and make 20 people reconsider their career choices without saying good morning. Adrian turned toward the window. That sounds exaggerated. I hope so. I need this job. The humor faded from Evan's face. It is the first real opportunity one have had in months. The train began slowing again. Adrian glanced at the folder in Evan's hands, then at the platform approaching outside. Then do not be late. The doors opened. Evan stood. Thanks for the shoulder, Adrian. Good luck, Evan. Evan hurried onto the platform and disappeared into the crowd. Adrian remained seated until his phone vibrated. His assistant's name filled the screen. He answered. Mr. Cross, the board is waiting. Where are you? Adrian watched Evan race toward the connecting train. I will be there. Shortly. He ended the call, opened the morning interview schedule his assistant had sent earlier, and found a familiar name near the bottom. Evan Miller. Adrian stared at it for several seconds before quietly locking his phone. Evan reached the Crosswell Industries lobby at 8:51 a.m., breathless but technically early, which felt like a miracle considering how the morning had begun. The 40-story tower rose above downtown Chicago in glass and steel, and everything inside seemed designed to remind visitors that important decisions happened there. Evan checked his reflection in a polished elevator door, straightened his collar, and tried to flatten the stubborn section of hair that had apparently spent the train ride developing its own personality. At reception, a woman named Melissa checked his identification and directed him to the 27th floor. Interviews are in conference room C, she said. You have 9 minutes. Plenty of time. Evan replied with confidence he did not feel. He stepped into an elevator occupied by 3 people in tailored business clothes. Nobody spoke. Evan pressed 27 and watched the numbers climb. 23, 24, 25. The doors began closing at 26, then stopped when a hand appeared between them. They reopened. Adrian stepped inside. Evan's nervousness vanished beneath immediate surprise. Adrian. Every person in the elevator became noticeably still. Adrian looked at him, and for half a second the severe expression on his face softened. Evan. Evan smiled. You made it. One of the executives beside him slowly turned his head. Adrian pressed 39. So did you. Barely. Your express train advice saved me. Evan noticed the others exchanging quick glances, but he assumed they were annoyed by the conversation. I suppose this means we both survived the morning. Adrian's mouth almost curved into a smile. Then the woman standing nearest the control panel adjusted the tablet in her hands and said, Good morning, Mr. Cross. The board members have been moved to conference room 1. Legal is already waiting. Evan stopped breathing for a moment. Mr. Cross. His eyes moved from the woman to Adrian, then to the discreet silver initials on Adrian's briefcase. AC. The pieces connected with horrifying speed. Crosswell Industries. Adrian Cross. The chief executive officer Evan had described as terrifying while sitting directly beside him. Oh, Evan whispered. Adrian met his stare. You seem surprised. You said you knew the company a little. I do. The elevator reached 27 with a soft chime. The doors opened, but Evan did not move. The executive beside him cleared his throat. Evan stepped into the hallway, then turned around. For the record, I would like to formally withdraw approximately half of everything I said on the train. Adrian's expression remained composed, but there was unmistakable amusement in his eyes now. Only half. I need time to evaluate the rest. The doors closed between them. Evan stood frozen until a receptionist called his name. He forced himself toward conference room C, repeating that the interview still mattered, that he had prepared for this, and that accidentally insulting the chief executive officer was not necessarily the end of a career that had not started yet. 30 minutes later, Evan sat across from 3 hiring managers answering questions about customer operations, scheduling systems, and conflict resolution. He gradually forgot Adrian and focused on the work. When the interview ended, one manager smiled and said they would contact him within 2 business days. Evan left believing he had done reasonably well. On the 39th floor, however, Adrian entered his office to find a digital folder waiting on his desk. Final candidates for operations support, his assistant explained. Human Resources wants executive approval before noon. Adrian opened the file. Evan Miller appeared first. He read the resume once, then closed it. Remove me from this hiring decision. His assistant blinked. Sir. Adrian looked toward the windows overlooking Chicago. I met Mr. Miller before his interview. My opinion would compromise the process. The assistant nodded and collected the tablet, but paused at the door. Adrian Cross had personally approved hundreds of hiring decisions. He had never recused himself from one before. The email arrived 48 hours later while Evan was restocking coffee cups behind the counter of the neighborhood diner where he worked temporary afternoon shifts. He read the first sentence 3 times before believing it. Crosswell Industries was offering him the position. By Monday morning, Evan had an employee badge, a desk on the 27th floor, and one rule for himself. Whatever had happened on the train stayed on the train. That rule became easier to follow after he saw Adrian Cross at work. At 10:15, Evan was delivering revised scheduling reports to a conference room when Adrian entered without raising his voice or announcing himself. Conversation simply stopped. 12 managers straightened in their chairs. A presentation remained frozen on the wall screen. Adrian placed a folder on the table. The projected completion date is April 18th, he said. The client contract says April 10th. Which date are we honoring? A department director began explaining vendor delays. Adrian listened without interrupting. Somehow that was worse. When the explanation ended, he asked, "What is the solution?" The director hesitated. Adrian did not criticize him. He did not need to. He waited until someone finally proposed redistributing the workload across 2 teams. Adrian asked 3 precise questions, approved the revised plan, and moved to the next issue. Evan watched from near the door, fascinated. The man beside him on the train had quietly sacrificed part of his morning rather than disturb a sleeping stranger. This Adrian seemed built from colder material. When the meeting ended, Evan returned to his desk convinced their strange encounter had been nothing more than an isolated moment. For the next week, Adrian gave him no reason to think otherwise. They crossed paths twice. Adrian offered only a professional nod. Evan was relieved. Mostly. On Thursday evening, Evan stayed late helping his supervisor correct a database error before Friday's client report. By 7:30, most of the floor was empty. Evan rubbed his tired eyes and stared at a spreadsheet that had begun looking like a wall of meaningless numbers. You missed one. He nearly jumped. Adrian stood several feet behind him, coat folded over one arm. Evan followed his gaze to the screen and found an incorrect date in row 46. Right. Thank you. Adrian glanced at the paper coffee cup beside Evan's keyboard. How many of those have you had? That depends on whether Human Resources tracks caffeine consumption. They do not. Then 4. Adrian looked unimpressed. 5. Go home, Evan. Evan leaned back. I have 20 minutes left. The spreadsheet will exist tomorrow. Unfortunately, so will the deadline. For the first time all week, Adrian's expression softened. You always argue with senior management? Only when senior management interrupts my excellent decision-making. Adrian looked at the 5 empty coffee cups. Clearly excellent. Evan laughed. Adrian left without another word. 10 minutes later, the elevator opened and an office services employee stepped out carrying a fresh sandwich, a bottle of water, and a cup of coffee. Delivery for Evan Miller. Evan stared. From who? The employee checked the receipt. No name. Evan looked toward the elevators, but they had already closed. The next morning, his supervisor called him into her office. Evan entered expecting another assignment. Instead, she turned her monitor toward him. An internal hiring review was open on the screen. There is something you should know, she said. Mr. Cross removed himself from your hiring process before the final decision. He made sure your application was evaluated without his influence. Evan looked through the glass wall toward the distant executive elevators. For the first time, He wondered whether Adrian's distance was not indifference at all. By the end of Evan's third week at Crosswell Industries, he had learned that people behaved differently when Adrian Cross was nearby. Conversations became shorter, posture improved, and mistakes were suddenly discovered before anyone had to point them out. Evan understood why. Adrian noticed everything. He remembered numbers from reports he had read once, asked questions nobody expected, and had little patience for explanations that avoided the actual problem. Yet Evan could not completely reconcile that man with the one who had let him sleep through an entire train stop. The contradiction made him forget, occasionally, that he was supposed to be intimidated. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Evan entered a conference room to deliver updated client projections. Adrian was standing beside the windows while 6 department heads debated a delayed contract. Evan placed the folders on the table, glanced at Adrian, and stopped. His tie was perfectly straight. His expression was controlled, but there were shadows beneath his eyes that Evan recognized immediately. "You look tired," Evan said. Silence dropped across the room. One manager stared at him as if he had just ignored some unwritten corporate law. Adrian slowly turned. "Do I?" Evan realized what he had done. "A little." Nobody moved. Then Adrian asked, "Is that your professional assessment, Mr. Miller?" Evan considered retreating, but something about Adrian's expression told him not to. "My professional assessment is that coffee stops being a personality after the 4th cup." Someone near the end of the table looked down to hide a smile. Adrian glanced at the mug beside his laptop. Noted. Evan escaped with what remained of his dignity. By lunchtime, 2 co-workers had already asked whether he had a secret wish to get fired. Evan laughed it off, but afterward he became more careful. Adrian was his chief executive officer, not the quiet stranger from the morning train. That distinction mattered. For several days, Evan deliberately kept their conversations brief. If Adrian entered a room, Evan found something useful to do elsewhere. If they crossed paths, he offered the same polite greeting he would give any executive. He told himself the distance was sensible. Adrian seemed to agree. Then Friday arrived with freezing rain sweeping across Chicago. A signal problem delayed several train lines, and Evan reached the station after 8 p.m. The platform was nearly empty. He pulled his coat tighter and walked toward a bench beneath an overhead heater. Someone was already standing there. Adrian. No tailored executive entourage. No waiting driver. Just Adrian in a dark overcoat, one hand holding a paper cup while rain traced silver lines beyond the platform roof. Evan slowed. "You take the train at night too?" Adrian looked over. "Sometimes. I assumed chief executive officers were transported everywhere in black cars. Only the particularly terrifying ones." Evan stared at him, then laughed when he realized Adrian remembered their first conversation. The approaching train was announced as another 20 minutes late. Evan sat on the bench. After a moment, Adrian sat at the opposite end. "Long day?" Evan asked. "Yes." "You still look tired." Adrian gave him a sideways glance. "You are remarkably consistent. It is one of my better qualities." For several seconds, neither spoke. Without the glass tower around them, Adrian seemed different again, quieter somehow. Evan noticed the city reflected in the wet tracks and heard rain tapping against the metal roof. "Why the train?" he asked. "You could obviously take a car." Adrian looked down the empty tracks. His answer took longer than Evan expected. "My father used to bring me downtown on this line when I was young. Saturday mornings. No assistants. No meetings. Just the train and breakfast afterward." Evan heard something in his voice that had never appeared in the boardroom. "Do you still go to the same breakfast place?" Adrian looked at him. "It closed 12 years ago. That was going to be my next restaurant recommendation." A small smile appeared. Then the loudspeaker announced their train. As the headlights emerged through the rain, Adrian stood and looked at Evan. "Taking the train?" Evan smiled and rose beside him, apparently with senior management. The delayed train arrived with a rush of warm air and the metallic hum of opening doors, and Evan followed Adrian into a nearly empty car. They chose seats across from each other at first, maintaining the careful distance that made sense between an employee and the man whose name was attached to the building where that employee worked. But after 3 stops, a family boarded with 2 sleepy children, and Evan moved beside Adrian to free an extra pair of seats. "Do not worry," Evan said as he sat down. "I am fully awake tonight." Adrian glanced at his shoulder. "I appreciate the warning." Evan laughed, and something about the sound made the cold, fluorescent train car feel less impersonal. After that night, coincidence became a pattern neither of them acknowledged. Sometimes Evan saw Adrian on the morning train. Sometimes they crossed paths after work. They never arranged it. They never exchanged personal phone numbers. They simply found themselves sharing 20 or 30 minutes outside the strange hierarchy of Crosswell Industries. Evan talked about ordinary things. The diner where he had worked temporary shifts, his terrible apartment radiator, the neighborhood grocery store that somehow charged $6 for strawberries in January. Adrian listened more than he spoke. Gradually, however, Evan learned pieces of him too. Adrian had inherited a struggling company at 26 after his father died. He had spent 5 years rebuilding it while everyone around him expected failure. The ruthless reputation had followed because Adrian had discovered that hesitation was expensive and public uncertainty invited people to make decisions for him. That sounds exhausting, Evan said one morning. Adrian looked through the window at Chicago passing beneath a pale winter sky. It became normal. Normal and healthy are not the same thing. Adrian turned toward him. You say unusual things to your chief executive officer. That is because I met Adrian first. The words left Evan before he could reconsider them. Adrian became very still. Evan looked away, suddenly interested in an advertisement above the opposite seats. Neither spoke until the train reached downtown. At work, however, their private ease remained invisible. Adrian was formal. Evan was professional. Weeks passed, and Evan began earning praise from his own managers for reorganizing a scheduling system that reduced client response delays. He liked knowing every good review belonged to him. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, the atmosphere changed. Evan returned from lunch and noticed 2 coworkers abruptly lowering their phones when he approached. A third gave him a sympathetic look. What happened? Evan asked. Nobody answered. His friend Marcus finally turned his monitor toward him. You should probably see this before someone sends it to management. On the screen was an internal group chat Evan had never joined. Someone had posted a photograph taken through the window of the commuter train several weeks earlier. Evan recognized Adrian's charcoal coat immediately. He recognized himself too, asleep against Adrian's shoulder. The caption beneath the image was worse than the photograph. It asked whether anyone still believed the new employee had earned his position through an ordinary interview. Evan felt the room become strangely quiet around him. Then another message appeared. Someone claimed they had seen Evan and Adrian commuting together repeatedly. A third suggested Adrian's decision to remove himself from the hiring process had been designed to hide favoritism rather than prevent it. Evan stared at the words until they blurred. Every late night, every corrected spreadsheet, every hour he had spent proving himself suddenly seemed vulnerable to one photograph. Marcus lowered his voice. Evan, you know this is nonsense. Evan swallowed and closed the chat window. Across downtown Chicago, 39 floors above the street, Adrian's assistant entered his office carrying a tablet and an expression Adrian had never seen from her before. Mr. Cross, she said carefully, we have a problem involving Evan Miller. Adrian read the group chat twice without changing expression. His assistant, Rachel Bennett, stood across from his desk waiting for the reaction that usually followed bad news. A decision, immediate and final. Human resources can identify everyone involved, she said. We can have the messages removed within minutes. Adrian placed the tablet on his desk. Removing them will not remove the accusation. Then we issue a statement. Not yet. Rachel looked surprised. Mr. Cross, some employees are suggesting you manipulated the hiring process. I know. And they are questioning Mr. Miller's qualifications. That was the part Adrian disliked most. He stood and reached for his jacket. Where is he? Evan was already inside Human Resources when Adrian reached the 27th floor. He sat across from Department Director Helen Parker with his employee badge resting on the table between them. His face was calm, but Adrian recognized the tension in the way Evan held his hands together. I want a formal review, Evan was saying. My interview scores, references, hiring notes, performance reports, everything. Helen nodded. We can arrange that. And until it is finished, remove me from the Whitmore account. Adrian stopped outside the open door. The Whitmore account was Evan's biggest assignment and his best opportunity for advancement. That is unnecessary, Adrian said. Evan turned. For one brief second, relief crossed his face. Then it disappeared. I think it is necessary. Adrian entered. You earned that assignment. I know. Then keep it. Evan stood. If I stay on it while people think you put me there, every result becomes another argument. Their assumptions are not your responsibility. My reputation is. The room fell silent. Adrian could solve this quickly. He could order an internal investigation, discipline employees, publish every document connected to Evan's hiring, and make the conversation disappear by lunchtime. That was how Adrian Cross solved problems. He applied enough authority that uncertainty had nowhere left to stand. But Evan was looking at him differently now, not asking to be protected, asking to be allowed to protect himself. Adrian understood. What do you want? He asked. Evan seemed surprised by the question. An independent review. Someone outside my department. Someone who reports to neither of us. Adrian nodded once. Done. Helen began taking notes. Evan continued. And I want the results distributed to the same management group that received the accusation. Done. No special treatment. Adrian held his gaze. Especially no special treatment. 3 days followed. Evan worked his ordinary assignments while the Whitmore project moved without him. He took different trains and avoided the executive floors, not because Adrian had asked him to, but because he needed space where every glance could not become another rumor. On Monday morning, the review concluded. Helen called Evan into a conference room and placed a 12-page report in front of him. His interview score had ranked first among the final candidates. His references had been verified before Adrian ever saw his application. His first-month performance metrics exceeded department averages. The conclusion was unambiguous. No evidence of favoritism. Evan released a breath he felt he had been holding for days. There is more, Helen said. She turned to the final page. The review also confirmed that Mr. Cross formally removed himself from your hiring decision 9 minutes after your interview began. Evan stared at the timestamp. Adrian had protected the fairness of the process before Evan even knew there was something to protect. That afternoon, the report was distributed. Conversations changed almost immediately. Apologies arrived. Marcus brought Evan coffee and declared the entire office ridiculous. Yet upstairs, Adrian was focused on a different conclusion. Rachel found him standing beside his office window with an organizational chart open on his tablet. The review cleared everything, she said. The problem is finished. Adrian looked at Evan's name beneath a chain of managers that ultimately ended with him. No, he said quietly. The rumor is finished. The problem is still here. Rachel followed his gaze. What problem? Adrian set the tablet on his desk. As long as I have professional authority over Evan, he will never know whether he is completely free to say no to me. For once, Adrian Cross was not thinking about how to gain control. He was deciding how much of it he needed to give away. The announcement reached Evan on Wednesday morning through an ordinary company email, which somehow made it more surprising. Crosswell Industries was reorganizing several reporting structures, moving Evan's operations group under an independent division led by Chief Operations Officer Dana Whitmore. The change affected 23 employees, created clearer oversight for the growing department, and placed Evan several levels outside Adrian's direct executive chain. On paper, it looked like routine corporate restructuring. Evan knew better. At lunch, he found Helen Parker reviewing schedules in a conference room. Was this because of me? Evan asked. Helen considered her answer. The restructuring makes business sense. It has been discussed before. That was not my question. Helen smiled faintly. Then you should ask Mr. Cross. Evan did not. Not immediately. For the first time since the rumors began, he wanted to understand what Adrian was doing without assuming the answer. The independent review had restored Evan's professional reputation. His co-workers treated him normally again, and the Whitmore account had been returned to him that morning. Adrian had nothing left to prove publicly, yet he had still chosen to create distance between his authority and Evan's career. Near 6 o'clock, Evan went upstairs. Rachel looked up from her desk outside Adrian's office. He left 15 minutes ago. Car service? Evan asked. Rachel gave him a knowing look. Not tonight. Evan understood. He hurried downstairs, crossed the lobby, and stepped into the sharp February air. Chicago traffic rolled past in ribbons of white and red light. By the time he reached the station, his hands were cold inside his coat pockets, and his breathing had quickened. Adrian stood beneath the platform clock. He was alone. You reorganized my department, Evan said. Adrian turned. Good evening to you too. Did you? Adrian studied him before answering. I approved a restructuring that was already under consideration. Because of what happened. Partly. Evan stepped closer, leaving several feet between them. The review cleared me. It did. So why change anything? A train thundered past on another track, briefly filling the station with noise. Adrian waited until it faded. Because the review proved you earned your place at Crosswell. It did not change the fact that I sit at the top of the organization. Evan frowned. You sit at the top of every organization you enter. That is usually convenient. Adrian's voice softened. Not here. Evan understood before Adrian finished. You did this so I would not report to you. I did it so your work belongs entirely to you. Your promotions, your evaluations, your opportunities. No one should be able to claim they came from me. Evan looked toward the tracks. That is a lot of trouble for one employee. Yes. The simplicity of the answer made him look back. Adrian was not wearing the expression Evan knew from meetings. There was no calculation in it. And there is another reason, Adrian said. I enjoy talking to you, Evan. More than I expected to. Evan's heartbeat seemed louder against the quiet platform. Adrian continued carefully. But I never wanted you wondering whether saying no to me could affect your job. The words settled between them. Evan remembered the first morning, when Adrian had possessed every advantage without Evan knowing it, yet had never used one. Now he was doing the same thing deliberately. The overhead speaker announced a train arriving in 4 minutes. Adrian slipped his hands into his coat pockets. There is a coffee shop 2 blocks from here. It stays open late. Evan waited. Adrian did not command. He did not assume. He simply asked, would you let me buy you coffee? Evan allowed the silence to last just long enough for Adrian Cross, ruthless negotiator and famously impatient chief executive officer, to experience uncertainty. Then Evan smiled. Only if I buy the second cup. 3 months later, Evan stood in a 27th floor conference room presenting the results of the Whitmore account to 12 managers who now knew him for his work rather than for a photograph. The scheduling system he had helped redesign had reduced response delays by nearly 20%, and Dana Whitmore had already asked him to lead the next phase of the project. When Evan finished, the room filled with questions, then approval. Adrian sat at the far end of the table as chief executive officer, listening without interfering. Their eyes met only once. Adrian gave the smallest nod, and Evan understood exactly what it meant. You did this. Not me. After work, they left separately, as they usually did. Their relationship had developed slowly and deliberately outside the office, 1 cup of coffee becoming dinner the following week, then Saturday mornings at bookstores, neighborhood restaurants, and long walks beside Lake Michigan when Chicago finally began surrendering winter to spring. Evan discovered that Adrian disliked sweet coffee, loved old jazz records, and still remembered the breakfast order his father used to buy him when he was a boy. Adrian learned that Evan talked to himself while cooking, could never keep a houseplant alive, and still checked his bank balance before ordering anything expensive even though his life was finally becoming stable. Nothing about them had happened because Adrian demanded it. Nothing happened because Evan owed him. That was what made every small step matter. On a cool April evening, they met at the station after work. The platform looked different without freezing rain and winter darkness. Sunset reflected orange across the tracks, and warm air moved through the city carrying the distant sounds of traffic. Their train arrived nearly empty. They sat together by the window. Evan loosened his tie and sighed. Dana offered me the project lead position. Adrian looked at him. What did you say? I said yes. A smile appeared on Adrian's face, open and immediate. Congratulations. You already knew, did you not? I knew she was considering you. And I stayed out of it. Evan laughed. You are becoming very good at that. It requires practice. The train rolled north through the evening, rocking gently as downtown receded behind them. Evan watched neighborhoods pass beyond the glass. Months earlier, he had boarded this same line exhausted, uncertain, and desperate for one opportunity to go right. Now he had work he was proud of, people who respected him, and a future that felt like something he was building rather than something he was chasing. Beside him sat the most unexpected part of it. Adrian glanced over. You are quiet. Just thinking. Dangerous. I learned from senior management. Adrian smiled and looked back toward the window. Evan studied him for a moment. The world still knew Adrian Cross as controlled, demanding, and impossible to intimidate. Evan knew the man who remembered which bakery sold his favorite blueberry muffins, who listened more carefully than people realized, and who had once changed his own plans simply because someone beside him needed rest. Evan shifted closer and gently rested his head against Adrian's shoulder. Adrian became still. "Falling asleep again?" he asked. Evan closed his eyes, smiling. "Not this time." Adrian said nothing, but his shoulder relaxed beneath Evan's head. The train continued through Chicago as evening lights appeared one by one beyond the windows. The first time Evan had rested there, he had known nothing about the man beside him. Now he knew his strengths, his flaws, his silences, and the kindness he rarely allowed the rest of the world to see. More importantly, Evan knew himself better too. He was not staying because he needed rescuing. He was not leaning closer because he was too tired to notice. This time, he knew exactly where he was, exactly who sat beside him, and exactly why he had chosen to stay.